You'll find this huge structure in the Guinness Book of Records because it's the world's largest floating oil production unit. To transport it 13,000 nautical miles from the Hyundai dockyards of South Korea to the oil fields of the Gulf of Mexico will require the services of another record holder, the largest and most powerful heavy lift vessel in the world. The only vessel capable of loading and carrying this enormous structure on its deck, the monster supership Mighty Servant 1. The city of Ulsan, South Korea is the meeting place for three giant ocean-based enterprises. Hyundai, the world's largest shipyards. Na Kika, the gigantic offshore oil production platform which Hyundai has just constructed for Shell Oil. And the incredible heavy lift vessel floating just outside the harbor mouth, Mighty Servant 1. The reason for this gathering of giants is to organize and conduct the loading of the Na Kika onto the deck of the Mighty Servant, where it will undertake a voyage of 57 days halfway across the world to Corpus Christi, Texas. The man in charge of this mammoth undertaking is former tugboat captain and loading supervisor Fritz Barendrecht.
We started with much smaller vessels, which we call barges then. They were not self-propelled. They were towed by a tug, but still it was a faster way of transporting things. And over the years we just made them bigger. Floating docks, dredging equipment, vessels. Like the clients make their cargo bigger, so we actually need to increase the size of the vessels.
In 1998, the owners of the Mighty Servant 1, Dockwise Shipping of the Netherlands, decided to lengthen, widen, and extensively modify their vessel, making her the largest of her kind in the world. The specially strengthened unobstructed cargo deck, 150 meters long by 50 meters wide, bigger than a soccer field, provides unequaled support for the transportation of enormous cargoes, such as semi-submersible drilling units, harsh environment deepwater jackup rigs, and large floating production platforms. As a result of the modifications, the hauling capacity of Mighty Servant 1 increased from 21,000 to 45,000 tons, which means it can carry twice its own weight on deck. Propelling the Mighty Servant 1 takes a lot of horsepower, 20,000 horsepower to be exact, from two main engines. But because the engines are located in the front section of the ship and their propellers are at the back, more than 500 feet away, it's not possible to have a conventional propeller shaft. So the diesel power is converted to electricity and sent via cable to 4 electric engines in the stern. All of which means she can move extremely heavy cargoes in one piece, in one go.
They want to transport bigger units, bigger drill sections, and well, you try to figure out how to transport it, and at a certain point the ship is just not even big enough.
Sitting in dry dock, Na Kika occupies a space equal to the parking lots of many suburban shopping centers, a whopping 6,400 square meters. It reaches upwards 55 meters, or 165 feet, higher than a 12-story office building. But there is a problem. This enormous structure is actually wider than the deck of Mighty Servant 1. It will overhang both sides of the ship and will sag somewhat. This will cause extra stress. Stress that could compromise the ship's stability. With 90 feet or 30 meters of cargo overhang, the captain knows that the Nakika platform is bigger than his ship. But with the right kind of calculations and ballasting, the right weather conditions for the loading, and perfect sailing conditions on the voyage, perhaps this heavy lift won't end in disaster. At the Hyundai Dockyard in South Korea, the world's biggest floating oil production platform has been loaded on a barge and will be towed out to the mouth of Ulsan Harbor, where it will board the largest heavy lift vessel in the world for a trip to the Gulf of Mexico.
When we float on, we'll be resting on top of this cribbing here. This is timber 300 by 300 millimeters in size, with plywood of varying thicknesses to compensate for the different plate thickness of the keel of the Nakika hull.
On the Mighty Servant's huge deck, the engineers of Hyundai and Shell Oil have designed a cribbing structure to support the Nakika.
Well, the cribbing acts like a cushion between the cargo and the deck. We placed a layer of plywood on top of the cribbing, and the whole cribbing will give us some resistance due to friction, which is most welcome.
This is 124.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
24, 24.
Good.
24 more. Wow.
Whoa.
36.
36. Good.
A 40,000-ton piece of high-tech machinery will journey across the globe sitting on a wooden platform straight out of the age of sail, secured by a maul hammer and a 12-inch spike.
This is the layout of the Nakika hull on board the Mighty Servant. This is the bow, the stern, and we're going to be positioning the hull against these two guideposts during the float-on operation.
Something very dramatic and very dangerous is being contemplated here. The Nakika on its floating barge arrives just off the port side. During the coming night, the barge will submerge and Nakika will be floating free by about 8 a.m. the following morning. To get one floating object on board another floating object, three things have to happen. Mighty Servant 1 has to sink below the level of Nakika's hull, 22 meters or nearly 80 feet. Nakika has to be pulled on top of the sunken ship, a ship that has become a submarine, to an exact position above the deck. Finally, Mighty Servant 1 has to rise up, lifting Nakika completely out of the water.
Nearly the whole ship is covered by ballast tanks, only the front down in the accommodation, the engine rooms, the rest is all ballast tanks, and of course some fuel. And we have a lot of ballast, and the ship was widened. There we have extra tanks installed, otherwise we cannot submerge sufficiently.
By carefully pumping seawater into its 50 ballast tanks, beginning at the stern and slowly moving forward, the Mighty Servant can sink below the surface. Depending on the draft of the vessel or platform coming aboard, a depth of a few meters or as much as 24 meters or nearly 80 feet can be achieved. That's an incredible 77,000 tons of water. In this position, the ship is highly unstable, and a miscalculation of the ballasting process could have disastrous consequences.
You see, when the ship is ballasted down, you have only the accommodation sticking out of the water and two small parts of the casings at the stern. And that's all the ship you have at that moment. The rest is underwater, it's nothing, like a submarine. And that's dangerous.
Okay, hopefully tomorrow morning we start loading the Nakika, which is that ugly thing that's just next to us. Okay, for the float on, we will have a draft of almost 24 meters aft and 22 meters and 30 centimeters forward. That's the reason.
Submerging to 22 meters will put the Mighty Servant near the outer limits of its operating capability. There will be very little margin for movement, from wind, waves, currents, or swells. The Loadmaster has calculated precisely the balance point, the center of gravity of the Nakika, as it rests on the cribbing and overhangs both sides of the deck. The maximum margin for error is about 12 centimeters or 6 inches. With 4 tugs steadying the Nakika and winch lines made fast to the Mighty Servant, a 5th tug will sail across the deck, pulling the giant oil platform into place. With the Nakika holding position, the Mighty Servant begins to ballast down, a procedure that will take all night. Most of the mass of the Mighty Servant 1 is below the surface. The bridge near the bow and the 2 stabilizing towers at the stern is all that remains in sight. Second mate Helena Lannertink takes a group of engineers across to the Nakika, where Loadmaster Fritz Barendrecht has been waiting since dawn. Helena is a native of Rotterdam and is one of 2 female crew members aboard Mighty Servant 1. She has been a sailor since her teens and would like to someday command one of the big Dockwise heavy lift vessels.
During the loading operation, float on, I am operating the workboat. And when everybody is settled in position and the cargo is coming near the ship, I sail out the steel wires which connects the Mighty Servant 1 to the cargo and which we will use to bring it in position.
Oké, stop maar even, Nico. Ron.
When the cables have been made fast on Nakika, Helena places some of the crew on the 2 towers, which bob above the sea on the submerged stern section of Mighty Servant 1. From here, they will control the cable winches and help to slowly pull Nakika into position. But there may be a problem. The wind is coming up. The sea swells are getting higher.
When the wind is 15 knots, which means in Beaufort force 4, there is a wind pressure of 28 tons.
The Beaufort scale, created by British Admiral Sir Francis Beaufort in the early 19th century, ranges from force 0, which is a dead calm, all the way up to force 12, a monstrous hurricane with wind speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. Even at force 5, the winches on the Mighty Servant 1 won't be able to hold Nakika.
When the wind is increasing to 18 knots, that pressure will go to 40, more than 40 tons. No way we can hold it.
Captain and Loadmaster remain in close communication, watching the meters, watching the sea, judging the Beaufort scale. The wind must be less than 15 knots. The sea swells must be less than 1 meter. The Shell engineers are anxious to get the show on the road. Their Gulf of Mexico oil fields are waiting for this monstrous pumping platform, and whether she sits at anchor or sails, the bill for the Mighty Servant racks up a steady $50,000 US a day.
Picking up stage, no choice. But now, I think we get a chance, another 1 or 2 hours to stay here.
The engineer builders from Hyundai are also eager to see the Na Kika disappear over the horizon, putting an end to their responsibility for its welfare. Fritz is worried about the swell, and the increasing wind will push against the Na Kika as if it were a giant sail. One option under discussion is to find another anchorage with less chance of wind and wave action. Trouble is, that location may also turn risky. The ultimate responsibility rests with the loadmaster, and after weighing all the factors, including the considerable cost, Fritz decides to cancel the float-on, remain in position, and wait for another opportunity. The tugs will take Na Kika back into harbor under tow. And Mighty Servant will return to the surface. The only thing left to do is pray to the dragon gods that guard Ulsan Harbor for better weather. Mighty Servant 1, the ship with the most muscle on the high seas, awaits one of her greatest challenges. The gigantic oil production platform Na Kika is looking for a lift from Ulsan, South Korea to Texas. But first, the weather has to improve, because in order for the Na Kika to float aboard the Mighty Servant, there must be calm winds and very little wave action. That's because the Mighty Servant must submerge like a basking whale and let the gigantic oil platform settle on her enormous deck. The weather remains bad. On board Mighty Servant 1, the crew work at routine maintenance duties, repairing a generator, checking on the condition of the engine cylinders. Responsibility for maintaining ship's morale has been turned over to the kitchen staff. Nothing offsets the monotony of a long wait better than a delicious meal. Prepared and served with a touch of artistry. Six days on standby, watching the waves and the shoreline. And now fog obscures even that possibility. But the weather report for tomorrow is promising, and the Mighty Servant prepares for the second attempt at a very risky venture. Day 7 dawns fair, so the float-on process begins again. All crew members are on alert as Mighty Servant 1 begins her dive beneath the sea. The mighty ballast pumps can move up to 8,000 tons of water an hour, and the pressurized air in the tank sprays out like a spouting humpback. As Mighty Servant 1 submerges, Fritz verifies the position of his deck markers one more time. Inches and centimeters will soon mean a lot to the safety of the ship.
Well, I'm doing the ballasting from here, and the submerging you have to do carefully, but that goes in 3 to 4 hours. Depends on how deep you have to go.
Nakika has come out early in the morning and is standing by. Fritz sets out for the Nakika. The swell is barely within loading limits, but the clients and the builders are insisting on another try. Behind him, the Mighty Servant is barely visible, 23 meters underwater, and the bridge bobbing just above the surface. Fritz will direct the float-on from the Nakika's deck, where he will have a good view of tugs, winches, and the guideposts welded to the deck of Mighty Servant 1. Posts that would be nearly invisible if not for the green plastic containers bobbing on the surface. With the lines in place, the tugs begin to draw Nakika in.
Kijk uit voor jezelf. In this case, we can have a tug sailing over the deck because the ship, even the deepest draft tug, can go over our deck without doing any damage.
With the winches pulling and the tugs battling the wind and swells, the giant oil platform Nakika inches across the submerged deck of Mighty Servant 1. One of the tugs will remain in position until the Nakika comes to rest on the cribbing. The tug will also be needed if the crew of Mighty Servant 1 have to abandon ship. There have been sinkings of heavy lift vessels in the past, and they usually happen without warning.
Stuur wordt achter ook de slek uit.
Ja, die draad gaat goed. Hij zit nog tegen de paal. Hij zit nog tegen de paal, dus gewoon hout gaat het goed.
Here we had divers and they check the position, and you see you are a couple of centimeters out, so you have to go down again. And refloating, shift it, come up, check it again. Still that movement going on, so when it was in position we brought it up, and then you see at the latest moment it's shifting a little bit. Then you check it by diver what the result is.
Loading an oil platform that occupies close to an acre of deck space has now come down to a game of centimeters.
Okay.
10 centimeters.
Yeah.
7 centimeters.
Yeah.
3 centimeters.
Okay. Now we are touching. Can the diver check again? I just want to see. She's about 3 inches to starboard. Okay. So I just want to check if that's acceptable. Because then I continue going up. I think the longer we try, the bigger the chance is that that pipe will come off. And I pull another line on this one and make it tight.
With the ship and its cargo both bobbing and weaving like two gigantic sumo wrestlers looking for an opening, the Nakika doesn't seem able to line up properly with the deck markers. Fritz directs Mighty Servant 1, asking for tiny movements to counteract the growing swell. Then, suddenly, something floats to the surface, something requiring the loadmaster's immediate attention. It's either damage to the Mighty Servant's cribbing or a piece of the Nakika.
From the wood, can he check where it comes from? The diver has to check where the wood came from, if it came from the edge or...
In either case, a harmless-looking piece of timber could spell the end of the second float-on and lead to another incredibly costly delay. As the semi-submersible oil platform Nakika was carefully floating over the deck of the submerged heavy lift vessel Mighty Servant 1, something snapped, alarming the crews, owners, managers, and insurers. Fortunately, it was an exterior section of the Nakika, and the engineers agreed that, although disappointing, it was not a serious impairment to its structural integrity or ability to function.
The wood is still there. Okay, but it looks okay for the rest. Refloating means we're taking water out of the ship and then we are coming up. And by this vessel that goes in 2 systems, we have pumps and we have compressors, air compressors. So part of the ship is pressurized and we blow the water out like a submarine. Other tanks are done by pumps.
Coming to the surface with an additional 40,000 tons settling onto the deck requires a delicate touch. Below-deck pumps and piping occupy a huge amount of space. In fact, most of the ship is nothing but piping and ballast tanks that can move water in and out of the hull at a rate of 8,000 tons an hour. But with a sure touch on the bridge, the captain can gently tilt or raise the ship a centimeter at a time.
She is not exactly in position, but we hope it is acceptable.
With all the adjusting and little things before you really start the full deballast, make about 12 hours.
We'll see you out here tonight, or are you going to get some rest?
Stay here.
Oh, okay, yeah. We'll see you tonight. We'll get out at night or 10.
Okay.
12 hours later, as promised, the Na Kika is high and dry on the deck of Mighty Servant 1. Early the next morning, Fritz walks to the stern through the tunnel which runs the length of the ship. With the Na Kika taking up so much space, he can't get there by walking on the deck. He wants to see just how Na Kika has finally settled on her cribbing. Fritz and the first officer also inspect the underside of Na Kika to see if all the anodes are safe. Anodes are the rust-inhibiting zinc blocks that work to neutralize the electrolytic action of seawater on the metal hull. It is remarkable to think that in a structure which is more than 80 meters wide, the final margin of error was only 75 millimeters off the original center mark, or about 3 inches over a 240-foot span. The Na Kika still has some freedom for movement. However, it will be very limited by 38 800-pound sea fastening units, which will be attached to the deck of the Mighty Servant by a crew of 60 welders.
From our office, we have planned the position and the strengths needed for the sea fastening. And they manufacture them, but they will weld them to the deck. It's their responsibility to do a good job.
The sea fastening, they are only pushed against the cargo. We don't have a rigid connection between the cargo and the deck. So the sea fastenings are welded onto our main deck and pushed against the cargo, but not welded against the cargo.
Welding the sea fasteners directly to the Na Kika's hull is out of the question. The monster on the deck has to flex a bit under its own stupendous weight, and welding would make that impossible. Power for the welding machines is provided by the Mighty Servant's own electrical generating plant, delivering 440 volts at 60 cycles, enough for 25 welding machines. When all the welds have been completed, the warranty surveyor, acting for the insurance company, will do a random check of the welds. If they pass this quality control test, a certificate of approval will be issued. The Dockwise company agent will then receive clearance to move the cargo out.
And then we set sail for Texas.
Anchors away, and the Mighty Servant is shipping out at last. The voyage will follow a routine planned weeks in advance by the second officer. She's created a trip binder, setting out the route on a day-by-day basis, and updated with the latest reports and warnings.
It's all detailed stuff you really like to know, especially with cargo like this. We have the wind with us, and our cargo and this ship is like a big sail, so we take more advantage from the wind than disadvantage of the current. This could be a very quick trip because we have the wind with us the whole trip.
We have well, it's about 3,000 square meter wind area. So you behave like a sailing vessel. And a sailing vessel is not rolling either, so we are not rolling, only pitching. And pitching is not good for the cargo, so we don't pitch, we change course.
The course to Texas will have a lot of zigs and zags, like a wartime merchantman avoiding U-boats. But the possibility of destruction isn't from sources hidden in the ocean. It's from the enormous and potentially unstable 40,000 tons of steel ready to crash forward if the ship pitches too severely, or flip over like a monster turtle if it begins to roll. Sailing off to Texas with an extra 35,000 tons on her back is the next major challenge for Mighty Servant 1. Following a route approved by the captain, the client, and the insurer.
It's a very long way around because we are too wide and too high to go through the Suez Canal, and we are too wide to go through the Panama Canal. So we have to go the long way around the Cape of Good Hope.
Let me show you the detailed map. From Ulsan, Hyundai, we go past Tsushima, cross the eastern China Sea, passing east of Taiwan, going through Luzon Strait, and enter the South China Sea. From Luzon Strait up here, we keep going southwest, all through the South China Sea, passing Vanguard Bank in Vietnam, then go south to the Indonesian archipel. Passing down south, entering the Java Sea, and go like this through Selat Sunda, which brings us into the Indian Ocean. And we go in a more or less direct line all the way to Mauritius, where we have our first bunker stop. When we arrive here, we have already done 6,000 miles. We get mail, we get fresh vegetables, we get fresh food, we get... Anyway, to be short, we get things to keep us running and things to keep the engine running.
The higher and bigger the cargo, the better sailing conditions are.
With the cargo reaching far above the deck and catching the wind, the Mighty Servant reacts like a sailboat, leaning instead of rolling, tilted to one side hour after hour like a giant sailboat on a broad reach. With the added assistance of the wind, the Mighty Servant 1 will do a steady 12 knots.
You're leaning into the wind. You take sometimes, with the lighter ships, you take some ballast in just to keep it in the right direction.
Day after day, the Mighty Servant 1 plows on through the most inhospitable waters on Earth. Too big to enter most harbors, but stocked with enough fuel to stay at sea for nearly 2 months. The diesel engines consume over 60 tons of crude a day, and also supply power for all the monstrous ballast pumps, electricity for the crew, and other support facilities. And even at this rate, the fuel capacity still gives the Mighty Servant a cruising range of 59 days.
There are navigational dangers and hazards. There are pirates in the area. All things you have to take care of.
Maritime piracy is on the increase worldwide, with a quarter of all attacks taking place in Indonesian waters. The pirates in their powerful motorboats swoop in after dark, firing harpoons at their victim ship and climbing up ropes onto the deck. To date, 20 crew members have been killed and 40 have been reported missing. Lumbering along at 12 knots, the Mighty Servant 1 may present an easy target.
This is not the easy ship to enter. As you see, we have the big deck, and then you have 25 meters of steel until you have to go up. We closed it all off in piracy areas, so they won't be really interested. And what they also like is little ships. They can change. They take the whole ship, they kill the crew, They change the ship a little, change the funnel, paint it over, and then they can use the ship. This is not a ship you can use or hide. This will be always recognizable. The whole world knows these ships. And now there are places you can't even go close to as 50 miles, like Somalia and stuff like that. It's all piracy everywhere.
After a 57-day voyage, the Mighty Servant I arrives at Corpus Christi, Texas. Her immense cargo, the oil production platform Na Kika, is safely home. They have, through good luck and good management, avoided storms, collisions, and pirates. The channel the Na Kika must navigate in order to reach the dock is very narrow. And because of her ability to trap wind and act like a giant sail, the captain will wait for calm weather before he ventures any closer.
When we are over the limit of the wind, and the wind's coming in the wrong direction, we don't go in anyway. Then we wait for better weather, like we did yesterday. We stayed outside because the wind was not favorable.
With the wind conditions just right, Mighty Servant I slips through the outskirts of Corpus Christi, dwarfing the condos on the shore, offering them a spectacular and unexpected vista. The Kiewit Offshore Services Yard will be the Na Kika's home for the next 55 days. And she will remain tied up at dockside as engineers check out the operating and safety mechanisms.
Our primary focus here is what we call a certificate of inspection, which is the Coast Guard certification that you can put people on board safely.
The proud owners of the Na Kika can't wait to get their new platform into production. There's a big shipping bill of some $7 million to be paid off.
Well, today's a big milestone for both BP and Shell. The platform is actually a semi-submersible platform, which is the first semi-submersible platform that Shell is putting in the Gulf of Mexico. It will be located in about 6,000 feet of water. Its fields will be spread out over 40 miles. So the total development cost for Na Kika is expected to be about $1.4 billion. So it should be producing oil and gas for 20 years out in the Gulf of Mexico.
With numbers like this in play, it's easy to see why there was so much concern in Korea about the fastest and safest way to get the Na Kika into the hands of her operators in the Gulf of Mexico. Now that the voyage is finished, it's easy to appreciate just how secure and powerful this big heavy lift vessel is, and why the name Mighty Servant is known and acknowledged all over the globe as the most powerful force in the mighty muscle ocean transit business.
When the job is done and you look back and you see such an enormous thing sitting on the deck, it gives you a good feeling.